Stay connected and stay hot with VIT Chennai. Feel the rhythm.
तुम सुनो सबको सुनाओ वॉइस इट वीआईटी रिदम तो फील करो मेरे भाई
வாய்ஸ் இட் விஐடி சென்னை கூட சேர்ந்து சிரிங்க சிந்திங்க கவலைகளை மறந்து ரிதம் ஃபீல் பண்ணுங்க
వింటూనే ఉండండి వినిపించే వినోదం వాయిస్ ఇట్ ఫ్రమ్ విఐటి చెన్నై ఫీల్ ద రిథమ్
ഇപ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ കേട്ടുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത് വോയിസ് ഇറ്റ് വിഐടി ചെന്നൈ ഫീൽ ദ റിഥം കാതോർക്കൂ മനസ്സ് നിറയ്ക്കൂ.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Horrible Histories, where I tell you guys stuff your history teacher could never. You're listening to Voice It, VIT Chennai's first and only campus radio station. This is Bhargavi, and I'll be talking to you, or rather talking at you, for the next 30 odd minutes. Because this is the first episode, I'll explain the concept of the show very quickly. The show is basically going to be me telling you guys stuff that happened in the past but isn't included in our history textbooks because, well, they suck. It's not a very hard concept to understand, but it is pretty hard to source content for because, well, I have everything that has happened to anyone to choose from. But I think I've done a pretty good job, and I'll let you guys be the judges of my sourcing skills. For the very first episode, I wanted to have a topic that wasn't very controversial, right? Something we could all agree on. And I think we can all agree that 2020 objectively sucks. We've had to stay home for almost 7 months now and wear really itchy masks. Well, at least those of us who aren't soggy breadsticks and actually care about other people have had to stay home and wear masks. But you know, it's probably the worst year that most of us have had to live through, at least collectively. Anyway, the object of this episode is to make you guys feel better about your miserable year by pointing out things that sucked more than 2020. We're going to be talking exclusively about plagues because, well, what better note to start off on than misery and collective death? So thing that sucked more than 2020 #1. I want you guys to picture this. It's the 14th of July in 1561 and you're in your house in Strasbourg. You hear loud concerned murmurs from outside your window, and because you're easily intrigued, you take your coat and sneak out of the house to see what the commotion is all about. You follow the crowd's noise through the dirty, dimly lit and unpaved roads. Well, you don't have to imagine this part because, you know, India. But you follow the dirty, dimly lit and unpaved roads until finally you come across dozens of your neighbors gathered around a dancing woman. It seems like a lot of fun at first, but something's off. The woman looks to be in great pain and her face is sad. It's almost as if she's doing all of this involuntarily. Her limbs move energetically, so energetically in fact that it almost seems violent, and her clothes are drenched with sweat, indicating that she's been doing this for a couple of hours now. And as you look on, she suddenly collapses from fatigue. The people around you look just as confused as you do. Some go to check on her, but most leave with amused looks on their faces, thinking the show's over. But when you or anyone else least expects it, the woman wakes up and again resumes her dancing. And she dances and dances and faints and dances for 6 days straight. Even stranger, others start to obsessively dance on their own, and soon whole parties of delirious dancers begin to fill the streets. That woman's name was Frotrophy, and just days after her initial dance, the number of sufferers grew larger and larger, soon leading the superstitious populace to believe that the plague was sent by God as punishment for their sins. With fear and paranoia at Strasbourg's breaking point, the governing body of Strasbourg stepped in to apply their solution to the problem, which included paying healthy citizens to dance with the affected and actually hiring musicians to fill the streets with the sound of music in order to make it easier to dance. And while you can blame the government for this, and you should, this was actually because the city's physicians hypothesized that the dancing was used as a form of stress relief. But it turns out that no one was cured by having that dancing facilitated. In fact, even more people joined in on the fun. As a last resort, the council ordered healthy citizens to take up the sufferers so they could be loaded and tied down onto wagons. The idea was to transport them to a religious shrine some 25 miles away in the hope that the remedy lay in religious cleansing. And all of this actually happened to actual people. It's dubbed the dancing plague, and some people even ended up dying from it. And if you're still a fan of dancing, I don't even know what to tell you. Oddly enough, though, that seemed to do the trick. The pilgrimage helped recover many of the estimated 400 people afflicted that summer alone. And that was the last time that incident was seen in Strasbourg, but it wasn't the first time that this plague haunted Europe. There's a surprisingly detailed amount of historical records documenting the dancing sickness, most of them from the medieval period. Just one of them comes from 1374, when the major outbreak of dancing plague erupted in Germany, the Netherlands, and France, where thousands reportedly danced to their deaths from town to town, shrieking like demons. So in 2020, with all of our scientific advancements, do we know what caused the dancing plague? Not really. Experts, and yes, there are experts in this particular subject as well, they disagree with the cause to this day. Some of them blame a fungus that grew on crops called ergot. It is said to bring about wild hallucinations, and it's actually what LSD is synthesized from. But some others believe it was all in their heads. People, as a rule, succumb pretty easily to the power of suggestion, and when you throw in a little religious mysticism, you've got yourself a patented example of medieval mass hysteria illustrated by the recent untimely death of a popular Indian celebrity in 2020. That being said, the plague is still pretty scary and, to say the least, quite strange. Before we move on to thing that sucked more than 2020 #2, here's a sneak peek of yet another fascinating show from Voice's RJ. Then that sucked more than 2020 #2. In the year 1348, history turned a pretty dark corner. The Black Death, or as the biology people like to call it, pestilentia, destroyed a higher percentage of population than any other recorded event in all of human history, killing more people than Stalin and Hitler combined. Eyewitness accounts state, and I quote, "The living was scarcely enough to bury the dead." So the Black Plague originated, or actually hibernated, in a Mongol Khanate that had recently converted to Islam. They were waging a religious war on the Christians in their territory, so trade and relationships with religions other than Islam were no longer tolerated. I say hibernated here because the Mongols had dealt with this plague for years. They had lived with it to the point that a certain section of their population had developed an amount of immunity towards it. The epidemic that would later lead to the outbreak, and what history would call the Black Death, started in 1346. The Mongols attacked the walled city of Kaffa, which was the last trading station in their region that they didn't control. This fortress, however, was manned by the Italians and Genoese. The siege lasted from autumn to spring of the next year, that is autumn 1346 to the spring of 1347, but due to the ramparts and stellar defenses of Kaffa, the Mongols were unable to conquer the city. This understandably made the Mongols very, very upset, because imagine taking an entire army and sitting outside a fortress for almost a year just to realize that the wall was too tall for you. So in all their desperation, the Mongol army started rounding up their dead, all their soldiers, peasants, and other unfortunates that had been killed and infected in whatever order by the plague. So for a month, they grabbed these corpses and flung them over the walls of Kaffa. They actually used literal catapults to throw bodies over the fortress. This is all well and good on the Mongol side, but imagine being a person living in Kaffa, just going about your day-to-day activities, and suddenly it starts raining rotten corpses, right? There's just rotten arms, rotten legs, and like heads just falling from the sky. The city was carpet bombed, with the Mongols employing a very, very primitive form of biological warfare. When spring finally arrived, the Italians somehow managed to slip unnoticed and board ships and sail away. But it was already too late because the Mongols had poisoned most of the people inside the fortress and by extension, most of mankind. The Black Death had already hitched a ride on one of the dozens of trading vessels leaving the city. On those ships, the feast proliferated, gorging themselves on flesh and forging a symbiotic relationship with one of the most resilient and widespread mammals in the world, the black rat. For context, this disease is spread when infected fleas that normally live on black rats land on people and bite them. So a person suffering from bubonic plague in the Middle Ages had around a 60% chance of dying within 2 to 5 days of being infected. And on a ship, there wasn't really a safe way to dispose of a body, let alone an infected one. I mean, there kind of was, but I'm pretty sure that those people didn't want to just yeet their friends into the ocean, dead or not. Interestingly though, ghost ships was something very, very common back then, where people and merchants, right, they would just stumble onto vessels, either harbored or adrift in the sea, only to discover that everyone on the ship had perished. Each time the ships would make the harbor, the rats would spread the disease. So ships, right, they would actually dock and voluntarily shut down in bays outside of harbors for 40 days, or in Italian, quaranta. This is actually where we get the word quarantine from. In May 1347, the Italian ships from Kafta, it hit one of the most happening cities back then, Constantinople. Think New York, Chicago, Tokyo, and Panama all rolled into one, and named after the Roman emperor that had converted his kingdom to his Christianity, right, his religion. Constantinople, now in Istanbul, was the jewel of the world back then. And if you played Plague the Think, you know how important it is to hit the population and travel sweet spot. Once the Black Death hit this hub, this sweet spot, it spread violently and voraciously, hitting Africa, Europe, Turkey, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean like wildfire. The first symptoms of the Black Death included a high temperature, tiredness, shivering, and pains all over the body. The next stage was the appearance of small red boils in the neck, in the armpit or groin. These lumps, called buboes, grew larger and darker in color, and eyewitness accounts talk of these buboes growing to the size of apples or eggs. The final stage of the illness was the appearance of small red spots on the stomach and other parts of the body. This was caused by internal bleeding, and death followed soon after. And as everyone knows, if you see a lump the size of an egg, the wisest thing to do is to poke it. And that's exactly what plague doctors did, being the geniuses that they were. And the liquid slime, the liquid black slime that oozed out to infect the next person, was one of the reasons for the name, I suppose. So some other treatments that genius plague doctors came up with during the medieval times were A. Don't bathe because God doesn't like us to be bathed. 2. If you absolutely have to shower, do it with urine and dung. 3. Sleep by a dead sheep and dream of sheep zombies. And 4, and this is actually in practice even now, right? It's very, very familiar. I wonder where I heard it before. Avoid bad thoughts and just stay happy. And a small woohoo for you guys. I have here an excerpt taken out of Edward IV's Plague Medicines, written circa 1480. And it says to take an egg that is newly laid and make a hole in either end. Blow out all that is within. Lay it to the fire and let it roast till it may be ground to powder, but do not burn it. Then take a quantity of good treacle and mix it with chives and good ale. And then make the sick drink it for 3 evenings and 3 mornings, because having a literal plague is just not enough torture. So the sheer amount of people who died of the Black Plague was so high that people started constructing houses and chapels out of all the bleached bones of the victims. One of the most famous of these churches that still stands today is said to be haunted by all the dead from that period. It stands in Kutna Hora, Sedlak or Suwari in the Czech Republic if you want to take a vacation there or whatever. Plague cross, which is a term I use here loosely, is something like the notices that government officials stick, right,
in 2020 on houses that have people that have tested positive for the coronavirus, right? But plague cross, uh, they started appearing all over Eurasia during and after the plague. They were markers of structures, mostly in the town square, right, or outside houses, to pinpoint an infected house, and later they used the same thing to commemorate the dead. But also, every time there's an outbreak of this kind, like the Spanish flu or like coronavirus, the Pope prays every day under a plague cross, which is not any plague cross. It's a special one brought from the Church of San Marcello al Corso. The cross is said to have vanquished the 1522 outbreak of the plague in Rome. During 16 days, the monks, right, like back in 1522, monks actually marched with this cross to a non-stop procession and beat back the plague, apparently. So it's a holy relic and it's said to perform miracles. Let's hope it does. And talking about religion, the Black Death actually robbed the churches of part of their mystique and power. When the devastation took place, the churches were at a loss on how to help people out. So humanity shunned religion and started to dedicate its existence to science. It's not all grim and dark and deathy. There's also some unlikely good things that came out of this Black Plague, right? So people whose great ad nauseum forefathers suffered the plague and survived, obviously, have a greater immunity, like a greater immune system. Like how great? So great that they might just have a genetic super gene that makes them immune to HIV. It's that period, right? The Black Plague also popularized perfume, which if you've ever been in a VIT Chennai lift, you should be very, very thankful for. Bad air on account of all the dead bodies which were piled outside of walls because, well, no one could bury them without being exposed to the plague themselves, became a major issue. Like bad air became a major issue during the Black Death. In many senses, eau de cologne and perfume became proliferous during this era on account of the plague and bad smell, obviously. Now that we've heard of two things worse than this hellscape that we're being subjected to right now, I'd like you guys to know that the Black Plague still exists in the modern world. A plague outbreak occurred in 1994 in a remote region of India. I'm not going to disclose which region to keep suspense intact, so enjoy. And the bubonic plague is actually back in the news because a city in northern China sounded an alert after a suspected case of the same in 2020. So we have more to look forward to. Today, we have masks too, and most of those masks are comfortable and cute. But we still have stubborn people that refuse to wear one. But back then, the big mask was as close as a physician could get to warding off the disease. Because they thought that the bubonic plague spread through air, which it didn't, but the coronavirus actually does. Okay, so the mask actually resembled a bird, and if you've ever seen pictures, you know what I'm talking about because I've always thought it looked like a crow. Right? The face mask wasn't just a scary looking fashion statement, right, of whatever kind. It was actually intended to protect the doctor from miasma. Miasma means bad air. Physicians believed that the plague spread through poisoned air because dead bodies and could create an imbalance once breathed in. No surprises there. To prevent the poisoned air from entering, incense and perfumes were common, right? Also because of the smell, I think. And the beach served as a place to store all these mixtures that were used to filter the bad air. This sounds ridiculous now, but when you think about it, this is actually the 17th century equivalent to our modern day filters that we have on masks. So this mixture was usually composed of viper flesh, yes, viper as in the snake, viper flesh powder, cinnamon, honey, as well as theriac, which is a compound of more than 55 herbs. So the beak shape of the mask was thought to give the air sufficient time to be purified by the protective herbs because the beak was pretty long. So the entire outfit of the plague doctors included a coat covered in scented wax, breeches that were connected to boots, a tucked-in shirt, and a hat and gloves made of goat leather. Rest in peace, goats. Plague doctors also carried a rod that allowed them to poke or fend off victims, which could actually be pretty useful to us right now because it's necessary to ensure social distancing because a lot of people do not understand the concept of social distancing or even personal space, really. So while you complain about wearing a mask because it'll ruin your pictures or selfies, which to be honest weren't even that good to begin with, you should be a little glad that you don't have to wear a literal bead. And if my subtle shade hasn't landed, to all you nice people, I say, wear a mask. With that, I'd like to end today's episode. I'm Bhargavi, history enthusiast and mask advocate. This has been Horrible Histories on Voice It. I'll see all of you guys next Tuesday with a new topic. Well, hopefully. Feel free to drop ideas in the comment section so I can pretend to consider them while going ahead with my already fabulous idea. See you next week.